She came back to Aldrich this spring, after 11 years, a grown woman now and a queen in her own right across the water, come home on a visit of state with a retinue and a husband and all the noise that follows a crowned head. And in the middle of the great welcome in the outer ward, with the whole household lined up and the banners out and the king's heir bowing and the trumpets going, she stopped. In front of me. An old gate guard she had no reason to know, gone gray now, posted near the back of the line where they put the old ones who have earned a place at a great occasion, but aren't fine enough for the front. She stopped in front of me and the whole procession stopped behind her, lords and ladies bewildered, and she looked at me a long moment, and then she said, quiet, just for me, under all the noise, she said, "You stayed." I have to tell you what that was like, to be singled out, because I'd spent 40 years making sure it never happened. A gate guard's whole skill is to not be seen. You stand your post and you let the great folks' eyes slide off you, and when a royal procession comes through, you become a part of the wall with a spear. And the last thing on this earth you expect is for the crowned head at the center of it all to stop the whole shining machine and look at you. The trumpets were still going when she stopped. They didn't know to stop up on the wall, and so there was this ridiculous moment of the fanfare blaring on over a procession gone dead still, the air half bowed and frozen, 100 fine faces turning to see what the queen was looking at. And what the queen was looking at was me, old Edrin, gray and creaking at the back of the line, and I felt the whole weight of all those eyes land on me at once after 40 years of being no one's business. And I'll tell you the truth, my first feeling wasn't joy. It was a kind of terror, the furniture's terror of being suddenly seen. And then she said you stayed, and the terror went out of me all at once because I knew her. Under the crown and the 11 years and the grown woman's face, I knew her, the way you'd know a child you'd sat with in the dark on the worst night of her life, and the knowing came up through me warm and total, and I forgot the 100 staring faces entirely. And she put her hand on my old arm in front of the whole court, a queen touching a gate guard which is not done, which set every tongue in the ward wagging, and she said, "Thank you for the hour. I've never forgotten the hour." And then she walked on into the welcome, into the noise, a queen again, and left me standing there at the back of the line with my eyes stinging like a fool's because she'd remembered. After 11 years and a crown and a whole life across the water, she'd remembered the hour. I'd thought I was the only one who carried it. I'd been wrong all these years, carrying it alone, when she'd been carrying it too, the other end of it, the whole time. My name is Edrin, by the way, for what it's worth, which isn't much. I put it down because a story ought to have a name attached to it, but the truth is she never knew it. The Queen of Across the Water thanked me by my deed and not my name, because she never had my name to thank me by. We spent the most important hour of both our lives together in a dark room, and I never told her what I was called, and she never asked, because a frightened child doesn't ask a kind stranger's name. She just holds onto the kindness. So she remembered the hour and the man and the arm she leaned on, and not one soul's ever been able to tell her the name of the guard who gave it to her, and that's right somehow, that's as it should be. The kindness didn't have a name. It was just an old man in the dark. Edrin, 40 years a guard of Aldrich, House Renmark, and nobody you'd ever have heard of, which is exactly the point of the whole story, so hold onto the nobodiness of me, it matters at the end. I should tell you about the hour. It's the only thing I ever did in 40 years of service that mattered, and it was against every rule I had, and I'd do it again, and I want to set it down now that I know she remembers. Now that I know it wasn't just an old man's private treasure, but a thing that passed between two people and stayed with both. But first you have to know a thing about me, or the hour won't make sense that a gate guard of all the people in that palace would be the one who knew what to do with a grieving child, because it's not a thing they teach you, there's no drill for it. A guard is trained to stop grief at the door, not to sit down in the middle of it. I knew because I'd had my own. That's the plain of it. Years before any of this, before I was old, I'd had a wife and I'd had a daughter, and the fever that goes through the low streets in a bad winter took them both the same month. The wife first, and the girl 8 days after, and I'd come home from a watch to a house with no one in it, twice, 8 days apart. And there's a kind of knowledge that comes from that which I'd not wish on a soul but which I had fully, down to the bone. I knew what it was to lose the person whose smell was in the cloth. I knew what it was to go looking for someone in a room they weren't in anymore. My girl would have been near the princess's age that year. That's a thing I've never said aloud, and I'm not sure why I'm setting it down now, except that it's true and the whole of this is meant to be true. When I came around that desk and saw a 9-year-old pressing her dead mother's shawl to her face to find the smell of her, I was not looking at a princess. I was looking at a grief I knew from the inside, wearing a child I'd lost the shape of years before. The rules said summon her women. The man under the rules said, I know exactly what she's doing on that floor. I've done it. I've pressed my face into cloth to find someone who was gone, and there's only one thing in the world that's any use to a person doing that, and it isn't her women, and it isn't a report. It's another body sitting down in the dark so she's not alone in it. I knew that because I'd not had it, the night I needed it. No one sat down in my dark. I'd stood my own griefs alone because I was a guard, and a guard stands alone, and some buried part of me, seeing that child, was not going to let her stand hers alone the way I'd stood mine. That's the truth under the truth. I didn't break the rules for the Princess of Aldrich. I broke them for a grieving child because I'd been the grown version of what she was, and I knew what the dark wanted, and it wanted company, and I was the only company there was. Her name is Cosima, Queen Cosima now across the water, but then she was just the little princess, the Princess Cosima of Aldrich, House Renmark, and she was 9 years old, and it was the night before they sent her away. That's the thing you have to understand, the sending away, because everything turns on it. The great folk marry their children to each other to bind their kingdoms, and they do it young, a betrothal at 9. A fostering, the child sent off to be raised in the court she'll someday be queen of, so she grows up among the people she'll rule, learns their ways, becomes theirs. It's the ordinary arithmetic of royal childhood, and everyone in that world thinks nothing of it. It's just how it's done. It's a good match. It's a great honor. The Princess Cosima betrothed to the heir across the water and sent at 9 to be raised in his father's court. A fine thing. A triumph of the king's policy. Everyone said so. She was 9. She was being sent across the water in the morning, away from her home and her father and everything she'd ever known, to be raised by strangers in a strange court. And she would not come home. That's the part the fine words leave out. She would not come home for years. Maybe not for many years, maybe. The way these things sometimes go. Never again until she came as a foreign queen on a visit of state, which is in fact exactly how it went. 11 years until she set foot in Aldrich again. 9 years old and being sent away for 11 years. A triumph of policy. Everyone said so. Nobody asked the 9-year-old. And her mother was dead. I haven't said that yet, and it's the center of it. The Queen, Cosima's mother, had died 2 years before, of the slow, wasting illness that no physician could turn, and the child had lost her mother at 7 and was being sent across the water at 9, and the one thing she had left of her mother, the one thing in all that great cold palace, was a room. The Queen's private study, a small room off the royal apartments, where the dead Queen had done her reading and her writing and her quiet hours, and which, because grief makes people strange, because the king had loved his wife and couldn't bear to change it, had been left exactly as it was the day she died. 2 years. Her books still on the table, her shawl still over the chair. The room still holding, faintly, under the dust, the smell of her, a particular scent the Queen had worn, I'm told, though I never knew her. I was an outer guard then and didn't move in those rooms. I learned the smell that night from the child, who pressed her face into the shawl to find it. That room was the last of her mother the child had. And the morning after the night I'm telling you about, the child would be gone across the water, and the room, I learned this later, the room was to be cleared at last while she was away, the king having decided, in the way grief finally decides, that it was time, that with the child gone he would finally let the room go too. So that night was the last night. The last night the Princess Cosima would ever spend in the same house as the last room that held her mother. She knew it. Somehow, 9 years old, she knew it. Children know more than the great folk ever credit. And that's where I found her. I have to tell you how, because I wasn't supposed to be there, and she wasn't supposed to be there, and the whole thing happened in a place neither of us belonged, which is maybe why it could happen at all. I'd drawn an inner duty that night that wasn't usually mine. A man was sick and I was steady, and they moved me up into the royal apartments corridor for the one night, to stand a post near the private rooms, a thing I'd done only a handful of times in my career. So I was somewhere I didn't know well in the hush of the great folks' private wing, late, past the household sleep, and I was making the slow round a corridor guard makes, trying the doors, the ordinary security of the night watch. You walk the corridor and you try each door. Locked stays locked. And you note anything wrong, and I came to a door I didn't know, a small door, and I tried it expecting locked, and it wasn't locked, it gave. And a guard who finds an unlocked door where a locked one should be does the thing I did, which is open it and look, because an open door in the private wing at night is the shape of 100 bad things, and you have to know. I want to slow down on the doorway, because I've stood in it 10,000 times since, in my head. The private wing at that hour is a particular kind of quiet, not the dead quiet of an empty place, but the held quiet of a place full of sleeping people, the quiet that has breathing in it somewhere just past hearing. My own footsteps had sounded too loud the whole round, the way they do when you're somewhere above your station and afraid of waking the wrong person. I'd been walking soft, heel down careful, the way you walk in a house that isn't yours. There were lamps in the corridor, turned low for the night, and my own lamp, and the cold that lives in stone after dark, and the small sounds an old palace makes settling. And I came to that one small door among the others, and my hand found it unlocked, and I felt the old familiar drop in the belly that a guard feels when a thing is wrong in the small way that might be the front of a large way, an unlocked door where there shouldn't be one. And every instinct went quiet and sharp the way they do, and I eased it open with my hand on my hilt, ready, braced, expecting God knows what, an intruder, a thief in the royal rooms, the bad thing the post exists to catch. I opened the Queen's study, the dead Queen's study, though I didn't know whose it was yet. And it was dark inside, and cold and still, the particular stillness of a room that's been kept and not used. And I stood in the doorway with my hand on my sword and my lamp held up, sweeping the dark for the threat I'd braced for, and there was no threat. There was just a small cold room full of a dead woman's things, books on a table, a shawl on a chair, and I felt the readiness start to drain out of me, half relieved and half foolish, and I almost closed it again and noted it for the morning. Door unsecured, the old study, nothing within, and then I heard it, a small sound, from behind the desk in the dark, so small I'd have missed it if I'd already been pulling the door to. A sound I knew, because every human being knows it, the sound a person makes when they're trying with their whole body not to make it. The sound of someone crying who is trying not to be heard. And every part of me that had braced for a thief went strange and still, because that is not a sound you ever brace for. There's no drill for that sound, and it undid the soldier in me in a breath and left only the man. And I lifted my lamp and I came around the desk, and there on the floor in the dark, wedged into the gap between the desk and the wall, knees up, her mother's shawl pressed against her face, was the Princess Cosima of Aldrich, 9 years old, hiding behind her dead mother's desk on the last night, crying the silent crying of a child who has learned that a princess is not allowed to be heard weeping. And she looked up at me, caught, terrified. I understood later, not of me but of being found, of being reported, of the trouble a princess caught crying brings down on herself. And I stood there over her with my lamp and my sword and my 40 years of knowing exactly what the rules said I was to do. And the rules were clear, the rules were simple, the rules said, this is the princess out of her bed, somewhere she shouldn't be, in distress. You summon her women, you summon the night steward, you report it. You hand the situation up the chain to people whose business it is, and you go back to your post, because a child's tears in the night are not a gate guard's business, and a gate guard who makes them his business is overstepping in a way that ends careers. That's what the rules said. I want you to know I knew the rules standing there, 40 years. I knew exactly what I was supposed to do. I'm going to tell you what I did instead. But you already know a little because she stopped in front of me 11 years later with a crown on her head and thanked me for the hour. So you know I didn't summon anyone. You know I didn't report it. You know that instead an old guard who should have known better did the most against the rules thing of his whole career, in a dead queen's study in the dark, for a crying child he wasn't even supposed to be near. Let me tell you what the hour was. I didn't go to her. That's the first thing, and it matters, because a big armored man crossing a room toward a hidden frightened child is a fright, not a comfort. I'd a daughter of my own once. That's a thing I haven't said yet and won't say much. She didn't live past her 6th winter, a fever years before, and I don't speak of her. But I'll say this much because it's why I knew what to do. I'd a daughter once. And I knew that you don't go asterisk to a frightened child. You make yourself small and you wait and you let them come to you, or not, as they choose. So I didn't cross to the desk. I did a thing that must have looked very strange if anyone had seen it, which thank God no one did. I sat down, on the floor, just inside the door, a good distance from her, an armored guard lowering himself down onto a child's study floor with all his buckles creaking, and I sat there, and I didn't say anything, and I waited. The crying behind the desk stopped. Caught held, she'd heard the creak, heard me come down, and gone rigid with the terror of being discovered, the worst thing, a princess caught crying by one of the guards. I felt the size of her fear across the room. So I spoke, finally, low, not toward her exactly, just out into the room, the way you'd talk to a cat that's gone under furniture. I don't remember exactly what I said. That's a true thing and an annoying one. The most important words I maybe ever spoke, and I can't give them to you whole because I wasn't being clever. I wasn't choosing them. They just came. Something about how this looked like a good room for hiding in. Something about how I'd found in my life that the floor was a fine place to be when standing up got to be too much, and that there was no rule I knew of against a person sitting on the floor a while until things felt better, princess or guard or anyone. Something like that. Nonsense, mostly. Quiet nonsense, the kind you make to give a frightened creature time and a voice that isn't frightening to listen to. And after a while, a long while, the gold light moving on the wall, a face came around the edge of the desk. Just the eyes first and the top of her head, the way a child looks when they're deciding whether you're safe. Red eyes, wet face. The Princess Nell, 7 years old, looking at the strange guard sitting on her floor, trying to work out what he was, why he hadn't gone for her nurse, why he was just asterisk sitting there like a person and not standing like furniture. I'm not going to give you much of what passed after that, and I want to tell you why, because it's part of the carefulness I asked you for at the start. What passed between a frightened child and a tired guard on a study floor at dusk was small and private, and it belongs mostly to her, even now, even grown, even however far away she is. So I'll give you the shape of it and keep the rest. The shape is this. She came out, eventually. She sat against the desk, not near me, but out, visible, which for a hidden crying child is a long way to come. And she told me in the broken sideways way children tell you things why she was crying. And it wasn't a dark thing. I want to say that plainly because you've maybe been bracing for a dark thing, some cruelty, some plot, and it wasn't. No one had hurt her. It was smaller and more ordinary, and in its way, sadder for being so ordinary. She was being sent away, not cruelly in the way of great houses, which is cruel without anyone meaning it to be. There'd been an arrangement made, the kind great houses make, a fostering, a betrothal in principle. The small youngest princess promised to be raised half the year from the next spring in another house across the kingdom. A good house, an alliance, the ordinary commerce of royal children, and she'd learned of it that day. Learned she'd be leaving her home and her mother and her own small study with the one window, and no one had really sat with her about it, because to the grown folk it was settled business, a good match. Nothing to weep over, and they'd told her the way you tell a child a decided thing, kindly and briskly, and without quite noticing that the decided thing was the end of her whole small world. And she'd taken it away to the one room that was hers, and folded herself behind the desk, and cried as quietly as she could, because a princess mustn't be heard to cry, because she was already learning that her feelings about the arrangements made over her head were not a thing anyone needed to hear. That's all it was. A small girl grieving a thing that to everyone above her was no grief at all. The most ordinary tragedy in any great house, that the people who are moved around the board are people, are children and feel the moving, and are not asked. And I couldn't do anything about it. I want to be clear about the limits of this story because it's not a story where the guard fixes it. A guard can't unmake a royal arrangement, can't give a princess back the home she's losing, can't do one single thing about the actual sorrow. I knew that, sitting there. I couldn't save her from the thing she was crying about. That wasn't mine to do, and there was no version of it I could do. All I had, the whole of what I had to offer, was the smallest thing in the world. That for the length of one dusk in one room, a child who'd been taught she mustn't be heard to cry got to be heard. Got to cry where someone sat with her and didn't tell her to stop, didn't tell her it was a good match, didn't tell her to be brave or grateful or quiet, didn't manage her or correct her or hurry her, just sat on the floor with her in the failing light and let her be a sad little girl about a sad thing for as long as she needed to be. That's all. That's the entire kindness. It changed nothing. She was still going away in the spring. And it was, I have come to believe, not nothing. It was, maybe, the opposite of nothing, because there is a particular loneliness in being a child whose sorrows are inconvenient to the grown world. And for one dusk she wasn't alone in it. And a person who is not alone in a sorrow is carrying a different weight than a person who is, even when the sorrow itself doesn't change at all. We sat there till the light was nearly gone. She stopped crying, somewhere in there, the way children do, the storm passing through them and out, and toward the end she even, this is the thing I keep, the small bright thing I've kept 20 years, toward the end she asked me my name. Nobody royal had ever asked me my name in 12 years. I was furniture. Furniture doesn't have a name. And this 7-year-old, red-eyed, wrung out, sitting on her study floor, asked the guard his name like he was a person, because for one dusk I'd been a person to her and not furniture, and so it followed in her child's logic that a person has a name worth asking. I told her. Brannick, I said. And she said it back, trying it out, Brannick, the way children do, fixing it in her. And I want to tell you that a name said back to you by a child you've sat with on a floor is a thing that goes into you and stays. And I have been called many things in 40 years of service. My lord this, and at once that. And the only time my own name ever felt like mine in those rooms was when a leaving princess said it back to me in the dark of her study, with the storm coming up the coast outside. Then her nurse's voice came, calling down the wing, looking for her, and the dusk was over. When the nurse's voice came, the Princess Nell got up fast, and wiped her face with both hands the way children do, scrubbing the evidence away, and she looked at me with a sudden 7-year-old panic. The panic of asterisk, will you tell? And I did the second small thing, which was that I stood up, all my buckles creaking again, and I went back to being furniture. I straightened, and I put my flat guard's face back on, and by the time the nurse came round the door I was a tall still shape securing a room at dusk, and the princess was just a child found at last and scolded fondly for hiding, and there was nothing between us at all that anyone could see. I gave her that. The certainty that I'd tell no one, shown the only way it could be shown, by becoming furniture again instantly, completely, so that not even the nurse caught a thread of what had passed. The princess understood it. I saw her understand it in the half-second before her face closed up too. The guard would keep it. The floor and the crying and the name, all of it, kept. Our small soft thing, safe in the one place the hard world couldn't reach it, which was the silence of a guard who'd spent 12 years learning to keep everything. She went away in the spring, as arranged. I was there, furniture by the gate, the morning the small carriage took her off to the other house across the kingdom. The household gathered to see the youngest princess off on her good match, everyone fond and brisk, and a little relieved. The way a household is when a sad, necessary thing is finally done. And the Princess Nell, 7 years old, climbing into the carriage in her traveling cloak, stopped just for a breath, just for nothing. No one else would have caught it. She stopped and found me in the row of guards by the gate, found my face among the dozen still faces, and she looked at me just once and I looked back. And that was all, that was the whole of it. A look across a courtyard between a leaving child and the guard who'd once sat on her floor. Nobody saw. Nobody ever knew. She got in the carriage and the carriage went, and that was the end of it, I thought. The small soft thing complete and over, a dusk and a goodbye and a look, and I went back to my posts and my rounds and the long quiet years. It wasn't the end of it. That's the part I still don't quite believe, and I've had 20 years to believe it. Because she didn't forget. That's the thing about children that the grown world always gets wrong, always. We think they're too young to remember, too young for it to matter. We move them around the board and tell ourselves the young ones won't recall the moving. They recall everything. She recalled. Over the years, the long years, while she grew up in that other house and then was married properly and grew into a woman I only heard of, at a distance, the way you hear of the children you once stood guard over. The Princess Nell is wed. The Princess Nell has a son of her own now. Over those years, twice, 3 times, word reached me. Small things. A guard doesn't get letters from princesses. That's not how the world works, and it wasn't like that. But once, years on, a steward I'd never met sought me out to tell me the Lady Nell had asked, through channels, whether the guard called Brannick still served at Aldermont, and was he well, just that, was he well, and I said yes. And tell her I'm honored she'd ask, and that was all, and it was everything. And once, when my own bad years came, I told you about my daughter, the one who didn't last past her 6th winter. There were other losses too, the way there are, and a hard stretch in the middle of my life when I was not well, not in my body but in the other way. Once in that stretch a thing arrived for me, no name on it, no note, just a small parcel, and in it was a good warm cloak for a guard who stands at cold gates, plain, no crest, nothing that could be traced or that would shame either of us by being a princess's open favor to a guardsman. Just a warm cloak, anonymous, arriving in my coldest year. I knew who it was from. I never said, neither did she. That was the whole of how we kept it, the two of us, across 20 years and a kingdom's distance. Never spoken, never claimed, never once made into the kind of thing the hard world could get its hands on. A look across a courtyard. A was he well? A cloak with no name. The smallest, quietest, most carefully kept friendship a princess and a guardsman ever had, conducted almost entirely in silence, because we'd both learned the same lesson in those rooms, she and I, that the soft things have to be kept quiet to be kept at all. I'm old now. I'm telling you this from the far end of it, the whole long career behind me, the posts and the rounds and the cold gates, and most of it's gone gray and faded the way a life does, but not the study at dusk. That stays. The gold light moving on the wall, the small held-in crying behind the desk, the creak of my own buckles as I sat down on a child's floor and broke every rule of my service to do the one thing the rules had no room for, which was to be, for one dusk, just a person sitting with a sad child who'd been taught she mustn't be heard. I've thought about it more as I've gotten older, not less. I think about how close I came to pulling that door shut. How easy it would have been, how correct, how nobody would ever have known or blamed me, how I'd have gone on to the next room and secured the wing and never carried any of this at all, and how much poorer my whole life would have been for the lack of it. This one warm thing in 40 cold years, and I'd never even have known what I'd missed, because that's the cruelty of the trained life, the furniture life. You don't even feel the warmth you're walking past. You just pull the door shut and go secure the next room and call it doing your job. I almost did that. I want that to be the thing you take if you take anything. I almost pulled the door shut. I was a half turn away, my hand already on it. The whole of the warmth in my life was on the other side of a door I had every reason and every right and every rule on my side to pull quietly closed. And the only thing that stopped me was a sound, a small held-in sound, and some part of me, some buried unfurniture part, that wouldn't let me walk away from a child crying as quietly as she could so as not to be heard. Be the person who goes in. That's all I've got at the end, the whole of what 40 years taught me, and it took a 7-year-old behind a desk to teach it. When you come to the doorway, and you will, everyone does, a dozen times, the doorway where the trained thing and the human thing pull apart and no one's watching and no one will ever know, be the person who goes in. Sit down on the cold floor. Keep your buckles creaking and your flat face and all of it fine, but go in. The world is so full of people pulling doors quietly shut on the soft things, the inconvenient griefs, the children crying where it isn't anyone's business, so full of furniture, so full of us. And all it takes, it turns out, all it ever took, was one person deciding not to be furniture for one dusk. She named her son after no one I'd know. But the steward who told me she'd asked was he well, he mentioned, in passing, not knowing what he was handing me, that the Lady Nell kept, in her own study in that far house, in among her own things, a plain warm guardsman's cloak that didn't match anything, that no one understood, that she'd never explain. Kept it folded on a shelf where she could see it. I'd sent it back to her, you understand, years after the one she sent me when I was old and warm enough and heard she'd had her own hard winter. I'd sent a plain warm cloak the other way, anonymous, no crest, the way she'd taught me. And she'd kept it, keeps it. A guard's cloak on a princess's shelf, and a princess's cloak in a guard's chest. Neither of us ever once saying, across a whole kingdom and a whole lifetime, the small soft true thing that passed between us on a study floor at dusk, when she was 7 and crying as quietly as she could, and I let go of the door and went in. Take it carefully. I told you it was small. I never said it was light.